Welcome to Kubernetes SIG Architecture for Thursday, July 18th, 2019. The agenda is available and the notes from the meeting are available at bit.ly/SIG-architecture. And I'll go ahead and paste them here so we can get started. Okay. The first thing we have up today, before we get into issue triage or anything else, is we have a request for policy and guidelines regarding CRD namespaces outside of core. Is somebody on who can discuss this?
So I think Jordan and I are both on, which we're both poking. I was prodding him for a long time about it. So the high-level overview is that there's a bunch of extensions being made in the SIGs org outside of Kubernetes itself. And as Tim Hawkins has aptly pointed out, there's a lot of cargo culting that has occurred with regards to namespacing. And the PR right now kind of is I think probably at this current state, the least reviled version where we can agree to disagree upon names that we've found, where we kind of preserve that the K8s.io namespace or the Kubernetes.io namespace is reserved for core APIs. And we kind of propose the x-k8s.io as a potential place where people who are working on CRDs, namely extensions, and the folks who are working in sub-projects for SIGs can have a happy space for them to put their happy namespace to put their CRDs into. We kind of did some minor modifications to the doc as well to make it a little more explicit in areas. And I think at this point, I don't know if there's any more contentious issues. So if folks wanted to talk about it, I think now's the time.
So just so that I'm clear, as I recall, this was Lynn. I slowed Jordan down.
Yeah, arbitrary back.
We can't hear you, Jordan.
While he's deciding whether he's going to back off and retry.
How about now?
There you go.
All right, sorry about that. I think where we ended up was a decent spot, like just making it clearer what was needed to be carefully reviewed, and trying to find a place for SIGs to put APIs that matches sort of the same level of independence that we have for the Kubernetes SIGs GitHub organization, where SIGs can set up repos under that, and it's clearly understood that those are outside of the Kubernetes org. They're maybe not following all of the same patterns or conventions. It's a place for experimental work or sort of Kubernetes adjacent work. There were some questions around the x-k8s.io proposal, not so much around its existence, but in the future, if a SIG started an API there and then later wanted to, I don't know if promote is the right word, but it took off and gained traction, and there was a desire to move it or make it available under kind of a more official K8s.io namespace. What would that look like, both process-wise and technically? For today, you can't rename CRD groups. So I think as long as the guidance is clear about what it currently means and what the limitations currently are, if you do this, there's not a clear path for moving between API groups. There are desires, I think, to enable that, but we're not sure exactly what that would look like at this point. I'm pretty happy with the current state of that proposal. I know Tim Hawkins wasn't thrilled with it still sort of looking like K8s.io if you just glance at it, but I don't know if he considered that a hard blocker, if that was just kind of, well, I can live with it. I think he's out of the office, but yeah, I think where it's at, you said it well, Tim, it's an uneasy, like we need a place for people to do stuff, and this might be the best we.
Yeah, Tim Hawkins out of the office. I just walked by Brian Grant on the way here, and he at least is okay with the x-case.io.
Yeah, I mean, if our statement is that domain qualification is the important thing, then like anyone can get a Kate's looking domain and do stuff under it, and it's it's going to be considered okay. So I think us having an x dash prefix at least has prior art for experimental extension stuff in other areas of computing. I don't know. It seems okay to me.
So if I understand, to recap it here, we're suggesting that the Kubernetes.io or Kates.io namespace is only for core APIs. And if you're going to do something such as, I'll use the one I work on, the application CRDN controller, which is under Kubernetes SIGs, that should use x-kates.io instead of kates.io as its identifier. And then anything that's outside of the Kubernetes org should use their own identifier, not Kubernetes or Kates or X or any of that, right?
Right. Either things outside Kubernetes org and Kubernetes SIGs should use their own domains. Don't use a Kates.io or x-kates.io.
Yeah, and as soon as somebody needs to make a transition from x-case.io to kates.io, we will have to add a feature to the CRD to permit this.
Or I mean, there are multiple possibilities there. If there's still an alpha level, an extract, transform, reload might be reasonable. That's getting more into technical possibilities in the future. But I think the guidance for now, again, like listing out the current limitations about renaming, just for people to be aware of, seems reasonable.
So my understanding was that a SIG is completely able to place their API under Kates.io if they go through the API review process that we have described for being inside of Kates.io. And that was the previous process we made a year ago. Okay.
Yes. And there are CRDs. Well, even some of the APIs that we have today, the intent originally was to implement them using CRDs. CRDs are more of an implementation detail than like a fundamental characteristic of an API. And so things like the runtime class API or some of the CSI driver node info APIs, those would have been fine to be implemented using CRDs if they went through API review and we had a coherent story around how those should be installed and distributed. So it's more about how quote unquote official or reviewed or supported an API is that determines whether it's under Kates.io or under the more Kubernetes adjacent X Kates.io.
I think
So the goal is to give SIGs a place to operate that reflects that the work is happening under Kubernetes SIGs, but is sort of parallel to the Kubernetes SIGs GitHub org. It's one step removed from core Kubernetes.
So let me just back up here and ask a question for clarification. Did I hear that if a SIG-sponsored project goes through the API review process like anything else, it can use Kates.io or Kubernetes.io?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we really have to stop calling it core. It's not core in any way. It is reviewed or approved or something like that. It has nothing to do with what repo you are in.
Yeah, it's less about repo and more about, there are two dimensions. One is how official and supported and reviewed it is. And the other is whether the concept that is being modeled and surfaced in the API is considered kind of an extension or more fundamental. And so some of the things like CSI are going to be more fundamental because they are the extension points for storage. Whereas something that is building on top of fundamental Kubernetes concepts could be more of an extension and might belong under x-Kates.io.
That sounds really problematic to have. That's two concepts, right? So it's not just. It is core. It's a soft core concept. soft
I
core.
don't think we're ever going to actually close on what exactly is core. I think,
Well, I mean, I thought we had by saying this has nothing to do with what is core or not, right? We're saying like it's approved, it's API reviewed or not.
Well, I think what we say is that we encourage those that are going to be sort of more core to some sort of like, fuzzy definition of core to go through the API review process and actually be part of Kates.io versus.
Me, the types of things that would make something core are: is it going to be part of conformance? It should be considered core. Is it providing the extension mechanisms that we want extensions to be building on top of? So things like CRDs and CSI, those types of things are core. Like they are providing the extensions. They are not extensions themselves.
So I think one of the things that we need to do out of this is probably to clearly document the guidance, which is part of the reason that I'm asking and repeating back some of this, because having it in a pull request and a repo over here is great, but we need to get something over in the documentations, probably under CRDs and maybe even a blog post out that gives clear criteria. And so a squishy core means folks are going to come in with ambiguity. Is it core? Is it not? And so if we say it's part of the API review process, it is something like CSI that's got extensions, this kind of gives examples so folks can extrapolate it. Because I'm looking at this going, okay, SIG apps created the application CRD and controller, and it sounds like that should live in x-kates.io, given everything I just heard here. And so now I'm even asking questions like it's beta and it's applications.apps.kates.io is the current namespace today. How do we now deal with this? If we want to be in conformance, if not, what are the next steps? And so I just rambled about that. I see Derek has his hand up very politely.
Thanks, Matt. So the one question I had was, there was a discussion on the document describing how we would intend x-kates.io to be used. And Jordan, you proposed a prefix of the SIG name. Given that like our SIG structures have proven fluid over the course of the project and they're not really externally understood by users, is that really guidance that we would want to present versus the SIG just registers for a known subdomain under x-kates.io and doesn't carve up something beneath that SIG?
I think instead of bike shedding on this particular topic here, I think we need to have, like, as Matt pointed out, a whole document that gives sort of guidance and guidelines. Because that's kind of what my forcing this was, kind of a roundabout way of requesting that document of guidelines. Because as Matt points out, like, it's clear that there is a host of ecosystem that wants to do right by the community and to find the happy landing zone, but there's no guide for them right now.
Derek, my proposal about the SIG prefix, the problem is there are a few use cases trying to be accomplished by this one mechanism. One is give SIGs a place to experiment and iterate quickly. And so if every SIG can just assume that their SIG name is a place under which they can iterate, then that avoids conflicts on APIs we're iterating on. Some SIGs map some SIG names map pretty naturally to concepts that would make sense to an end user. So like auth or node or storage. Some less so. And so the idea was, and I agree with Tim, like this is getting down to the nitty gritty details. We can work that out like offline, but give SIGs a place under which they can experiment and own the full prefix space. And then if they want to have other prefixes that make more sense for specific APIs, just have a place like SIG-YAML where we can register those so we avoid conflicts. Trying to be low friction, but also flexible.
So how about this? I'll propose to start a document and share it out and try to initially capture the guidance that I think I heard here, and then we can iterate on that until it gets into decent shape and we can post it somewhere more visible and public with the guidance. Does that sound acceptable? I'll take the option to start this.
I don't object to iterating. Would it be better as comments on Tim's PR?
I'm okay.
Where we would want that to fold into.
I think
I'd
it's
like to get Tim's merged.
yeah.
And
I think we could.
iterate.
I think we can merge now what we have, probably, unless there's any major conflict. But I think we should do that with the preamble that another doc is coming and may refine this process even further.
Yeah, and I also think that the process itself that's here that talks about this is a little different than the guidance that goes out to the world. And those can kind of be two separate voices and guidance. But I can't say I'd merge it because I haven't actually read it. So
I think most of the API reviewers have read it or been involved in the conversation. I called for an act on kind of the concrete proposal and would like people to comment there. So Clayton, Daniel, if you want to comment there, Brian was okay with it if he wants to comment. And then we can work through kind of the mechanics and, like Matt was saying, fleshing out the guidance with examples and yeah, just wherever it's unclear, we can make it more clear.
sounds fine by me.
So we have discussed Tim's change to the API review policy document, but we haven't discussed the other thing, which is quite related and triggered this, which is the I think it's the CAP that David Eads started, proposing that basically we require CRDs claiming to be in Kates.io to provide a link to the place where they were approved. And the purpose of that, as I understand it, is to make sure that cluster administrators have some way of telling like what the status of this CRD is. Like anybody can write Kates.io in the group name. So this makes it visible to the person installing the CRD, like this CRD claims it's in Kates.io. This is the link I can follow to see why they claim that. Or I can put in there like I haven't actually gone through the process. So as an escape hatch. I don't know if David will agree with that summary, but I think
yeah, I agree with that summary.
Okay, and I think we're looking basically for this group of people to be like, yeah, that sounds good, or no.
I mean, based on the accidents we've seen, there are two main purposes behind it. One is so administrators can follow a thread to make sure what they have in their hand, the manifest they have in their hand, actually matches like the shape this API is supposed to have. And the other is just to prevent accidents. There was cargo culting of bad examples and things that accidentally used Kates.io namespaces that weren't even in the Kates project, Kubernetes project. And so this makes it difficult to accidentally make an API in a domain that you're not supposed to have. And based on the Kates.io, like where we settled for that, I don't think this really impacts that either way. The question about existing community APIs that are using Kates.io suffixes, the KEP goes into detail about what they can do. I mean, it's just an annotation. And so one of the options in the annotation is to kind of give an explanation like, this isn't approved. Here's a link to an issue about what we're going to do about it. We're going to try to get it approved. We're going to try to move it out of the namespace. We're going to see if it can get grandfathered. Like there's a variety of things that you could do, but as far as the actual mechanism in the KEP, it's really just asking people to put a pointer or a blurb about the disposition of the API. So things that currently exist, we're not gonna make them start failing on upgrade. We're gonna figure out again, what the path forward for those is. If it's getting reviewed and becoming official, and that's great. If it's moving to a SIG API, again, for those that are still in alpha, that might be more reasonable. For those that are in beta, it's kind of a case-by-case basis as we look at what's out there. But stopping the bleeding, stopping more accidents from happening, and getting awareness so that if someone tries to use this, they get poked to say, oh, well, you're using a namespace that has these review and support requirements. How are you going to meet this?
So it sounds like we don't actually object to this cap. Does anyone have a like a reason why it shouldn't proceed?
You know, I'm in favor of it. I think the API machinery and the API review folks looked at it. I'm in favor. Be interested to hear what other people think.
So I'd say merge and iterate, but I think we also, we probably want to make sure that we get documentation in for this, or at least think about it from the point of view of folks who are not sort of in the thick of API machinery. Like, what does this annotation mean?
Yeah, actually, the CAP and I believe the proof of concept PR have both been changed. If you get an error from this, the error will explain where you can go to read more about it. So.
Yeah, also documentation, kind of end-to-end documentation is part of the V1 CRD work. So examples and explanations about how CRDs kind of fit into the broader API process is on the list for 116 work to get fleshed out in documentation. So this would go on there as well.
History has taught us that whenever we try to make substantial changes in policy, that there's always going to be people who said, I didn't hear that. Perhaps raising it to SIG leads in more detail might be beneficial, because I think, like Matt pointed out with regards to their separate controller, there's a lot of stuff that exists, and there'd be a lot of stuff that people would want to change to follow the best practices here. So I think maybe having some broader awareness.
I don't really think that's a prerequisite, because the escape hatch for this is really easy to use. So.
Well, I mean, I think people want to do the right thing. So I agree that taking the policy that has existed and we're trying to figure out how to make people more aware of, and sending it to the SIG leads, channels, lists, KubeDev, like the places in the community that are building all these things, let people know now, so that stuff that's in flight now can, if it hasn't already been released, can tweak its name, and the stuff that has been can consider where it's at in its maturity life cycle and consider if they want to make changes.
Yeah, I mean, this is the reason that I actually wanted to get that document going, was so we get clear guidance for people, and we get it in some kind of written form. We're happy communicating it, and then we put it out everywhere. Blog posts, docs, community meeting, KDev, get it out to all the leads and shares, and just kind of blast it out, because it's a policy change, and folks may miss one place, but if it goes a lot of places, they might catch it, and it can start to catch on.
So I think that can happen in parallel and should happen as soon as possible.
Agreed. Okay. So it sounds like there's no objection to merging it here. And with that,
are we talking about merging it and iterating, or merging it marked as implementable? Do we think the CAP is in shape to be implementable, or is it just like 90% there?
I think it's implementable. The CAP is providing a means to make people aware of the policy that we already have, and it's not doing anything more than that.
The exact syntax of the annotation, is that in the CAP? I don't remember.
It is in the CAP.
Okay.
It's also in the poll. So.
Yeah, I have no objections to making this implementable.
Same here.
Hi. Any changes we need to make in the code for this CAP?
The code change pool is open, but
I
it
missed
would
the
be
question.
separately.
I guess my next question, though, is that do we want to actually have some sort of lockdown for x-kates.io to make sure that you at least point to the, the sub-project that's doing it as part of the Kubernetes project? Because it may be that people are like, oh, kates.io doesn't work. Let me just do x-. And
that becomes the new just put this in your CRD.
Yeah, well, and then I think looking further, like, if we're deploying, I don't know how far we want to take this from an extensibility point of view. Like if I'm deploying a Kubernetes cluster inside of VMware, do I want to lock down VMware.com and make sure that I have some sort of annotation or whatever? Or maybe we just say, hey, institute your own admission controller for that. And
so I have two thoughts in response to this. The first is like, if we lock down x-case.io too, then we'll need to provide an x-x-case.io for people to run to. My more serious thought is like, the problem here is like the problem of distributing something and knowing that you've gotten the thing that people intended for you to get, which I think people more commonly do this with like cryptographic hashes, and they publish those, and then you can compare and like you got the thing. We could maybe even hack onto the existing DNS system where like if you say you're in this domain, there better be something at that domain that matches like a list of known hashes or something like that.
That sounds like a future thing.
So
That's absolutely a future thing.
It also doesn't work for offline clusters.
The problem at hand was cargo culting of Kates.io specifically. And I think solving that in a really lightweight way now has value. The idea that you can like point to canonical schemas that would apply, like you said, Joe, for all API groups, by domain suffix or something, that I see some value in that, but I think that's a broader, bigger future thing. Also, please don't make me write JSON normalization and signing because I will stab myself in the nose.
All right. Now with that, is there anything else on it, or are we good with where we're at right now? Going once, going twice. Fantastic. Then we can move on to the next agenda item, which is the sub-project updates. And for that, we have API reviews. Jordan?
So just to run through some of the recent things that have been going on, the Windows run as username alpha field merged this week. That is the second Windows specific field in pods that wraps up the first round of proposals from SIG Windows that allows launching containers as a specific Windows username. So that is an alpha in 1.16. The admission webhook registration APIs got promoted to V1 after all the work that happened in the last release. A lot of that work was validated by consumers before and after the 1.15 release and was promoted to V1 with no schema changes, but some of the defaults were improved to make webhooks safer by default. So if you don't know that failure policy is a thing, by default, if the call to your webhook fails, the request is blocked instead of the previous default, which was to fail open. A few defaults like that, tightened up timeouts, things like that, but no schema changes. There are several reviews that are in progress. You can look at the API reviews board to see what those are. And if you have questions about one that is not getting attention, make sure it's in the 1.16 milestone and ping the reviewers who are assigned. If you are in a SIG and have changes that require API reviews, please make sure that the reviewers for your SIG are paired up with the approver doing the review to make sure that they're getting exposure and experience and lots of different kinds of API changes. That type of exposure is what we are looking for to start promoting people to have approver rights. So,
just on that note, Jordan, because I'm somehow missing it in the docs or in our meeting notes, we have people on SIGs that I do know that I'm trying to curate a list of people who want to be API reviewers and approvers. Where exactly do they go for that?
It's the root owners aliases file has a stanza for each SIG for API reviewers. So add them into there, and that's where we look when we are looking for people to pull in to reviews.
Oh, I'm more looking for like, what's the process?
Oh, so the the doc that your PR is touching has about 3 sentences about the process without a lot of detail. The shadowing that we've been doing over the last couple of releases is the first step of that, and we don't have a lot of detail beyond that. The shadowing is intended to get people exposed to different types of API reviews, and we haven't actually had shadowers that I'm aware of go through all the different types, like entirely new API types and API changes. So the document that you are updating is where those details would go, and that needs to be added to that.
Okay. So for the time being, I will not refine this doc anymore, but I'll loop back with the other folks.
Yeah, after we get this current PR merged, I'm happy to take a stab at fleshing that out, or if someone else wants to, and we can collaborate on it either way. That was all I had for the API review subproject. Are there any questions, or we can?
I'll add one note too. There was a cap. So after we are clarifying what node labels mean. It's kind of been unclear. Jordan and I have recently reviewed a whole bunch of PRs where domain knowledge wasn't captured in any form that anybody could reference. And so there's a link in there, which is we've tried to clarify what the original statements were and what a path forward for all the places that are vague today is. If you care about controlling topology of a cluster and you're either self-hosting or running masters on the cluster, and you want to be able to use features in Kube in a way that the very naive implementations today that we have that queue off of node role, the node role Kubernetes IO/master label, you'll be interested in this. I want to get some comments on the cap, and I'll send it around a little bit broader, but wanted to bring
the too long. The TLDR is behavior of Kubernetes components should not be coupled to node roles. So we're looking to transition those to separate labels that are specific to the behavior over the next several releases.
If anyone outside of Kube can go to town on node role labels, we kind of clarified core Kube may not in the cap, and extensions and SIGs, things in xk8s.io, we recommend you do not, because it's inflexible and not friendly for the wide variety of conformant implementations out there.
I think the thing that's missing from that cap, and I think I left this feedback on there, is like, what should we do? And it's been sort of the blocker to date, which is when there are manifests which for whatever reason want to run the master, what should they do? And I think the answer to date has been, we will address that with like pod identity and things like that, but those things aren't ready yet. And so I think we need to understand, like it is clarifying a subset of the usage of node label or node role, but it is in my mind complicating it because it leaves some very big questions unanswered.
Okay, well, let's take that to the cap.
All right, anything else on API reviews? Okay, let's move on to code conformance.
All right. So update on that. We met yesterday, actually this week. So I don't know if everybody's aware, but CNCF had hired some contractors from Globant to work on promoting. I'm sorry, we should be moving to code organization.
Right, I mushed the two words together.
Okay.
You started,
Sorry.
so go ahead and finish, and then we'll come back.
Okay. CNCF had hired some contractors. They're wrapping up this week, so we're just trying to get all of their PRs resolved. So anybody who's commenting on any of those open and needs approval, Clayton, I know you've looked at some, and Brian's going to look at some as well. There are a few that still need to be moved into approval, though, because they need some additional updates. Additionally, we have an effort going on. So CNCF is also funding Hippie Hackers Group II to. They've been funding the API Snoop work, but they're also now funding some work out of API Snoop. We got a bunch of information about different APIs that are not yet covered in conformance or even end-to-end tests at times that are being used by core components or by by different end-to-end tests incidentally. And so he's got a team working on promoting those or building end-to-end tests for those. That's making progress already, actually, which is good. And lastly, the sort of big thing on our list this cycle is trying to rework the way we do conformance testing to separate out the definition and review of the behaviors for what is conformant from the implementation of the tests. And so that we have a KEP for. It's gotten a bunch of reviews and needs some updates based on those reviews. But obviously, there's a lot of discussion on the issues there. So if anybody is interested, I've linked the KEP here. One of the things we're looking at there, and if anybody has experience with this, I would love your comments, is looking at, initially the way the KEP's written, we're sort of defining those behaviors just in YAML in our own bespoke format. But it's been suggested that using something like Gherkin or some existing behavior definition, DSL or something, might be helpful. So anybody with experience with those DSLs, or specifically Gherkin, I'd love to hear from that. I have sort of mixed experiences with that, or mixed thoughts on this. On the one hand, I don't like making bespoke things, but on the other hand, you can be boxed in by some of these. So anybody's experience would be helpful. We do have II is going to actually we're going to redirect some of the resources that we're working on API Snoop and have them focus on doing a little spike to investigate and build out some actual examples with the Gherkin language and make sure that it's expressive enough and we can make it reusable enough. The goal here would be that this group can go to the SIGs and say, we want you to define the set of behaviors that can be that are important to your conformance within your SIG. So stepping back 1 second, part of the KEP is building tooling that automates the low-hanging fruit of, you create a resource, you make some change to it, the state of the cluster converges in the way you expect. So we're automating a bunch of scaffolding for that. But there are things that we can't automate directly off of that. A sort of simple example would be pod-to-pod communication. There's no API that really is specifying pod-to-pod communication. We just expect it to exist. So some human has to write this behavior. And we'd rather that we can have that behavior approved separately from the tests that actually implement that behavior. We'd like to be able to go to the SIGs and have the SIGs define those lists of behaviors independently of the end-to-end test or the conformance test that evaluate them. So that's the state. Any comments are welcome.
There was one quick comment in the side chat from Dims. Did we need to discuss the auto-scaling conformance revert?
Yes, we do. Thank you. That was the first bullet, which I skipped over. Clayton, did you want to comment on that, or?
Sure. So one of the conformance tests that was suggested to be proposed to conformance was the node or the HPA horizontal pod autoscaling conformance test. HPA is a V1 API within Kubernetes. However, metrics and the supporting infrastructure for it is optional, and so we merged it. It broke a few things that didn't install metrics. Metrics has kind of maybe let's say a default or optional default implementation within the Kube project and a number of other alternatives. I'd say we've never made the statement as a group that metrics is required for all conformant distributions. And so this raises an interesting policy point of whether an API with a very clearly defined implementation that is part of the cluster HPA, its interface and how it's implemented relative to the metrics API might very well trigger conformance. It is not required on all clusters. And so there's a couple of paths forward. We reverted it temporarily from being added to conformance, but we need to have a follow-up in the conformance working group to discuss ways forward. A couple of them were, promoting the metrics to required, which I don't think there's a ton of appetite for. Another might be that the conformance test itself should skip if you don't have a metrics implementation installed. And then there's maybe a third or fourth option, which is this doesn't belong in the default profile.
Yeah, I mean, I think we haven't fully defined profiles yet, really. So strictly speaking, this is, I guess, optional because the underlying infrastructure is optional. But that I don't think that's a satisfactory answer that we've got right now for a lot of things like this that have, you know, I guess maybe this is just indicating we need to push forward on it.
Well, and it's a great example of it's a component that is part of what most people would consider the Kube API when it is installed and configured. And that behavior being defined to a reasonable degree for people who expect HPA to work with multiple different metrics backends is relatively valuable. It's not relatively valuable. It's not required that it be in conformance for that value to exist. But I do think it's a good example of we depend on an input, and once we have an input, we provide a defined behavior, and that's actually an opportunity for us to extend this and think about how we would handle other potentially optional APIs.
I know no one wants to talk about profiles, but this is the exact criteria that William Dennis had originally outlined as possibly an area of a profile. Like CSI meets the exact same criteria.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we definitely have a need to say, okay, there's a set of features that if they are enabled within a cluster, we want them to behave the same way in all clusters, and that's what I guess the profiles right now is around, and we need to, I guess we need to revisit that, but that would be in the conformance working group, I guess.
There's maybe a more general point here, which is many people are using the conformance tests to prove that they are conformant, so they can get a nice little badge of honor on there besides their name. There is the broader point that's come up in the conformance working group that's relevant, which is you can still use the EDE tests to test HPA on your own cluster. We're a little bit more informal about the EDE tests, whereas this is a great example of a test that probably, even if we wouldn't put it in the core profile, is a great example of getting this locked down to say, like, yeah, HPA works or doesn't in the set of clusters that have it is valuable. And so, yeah, triggering the discussion on profiles or getting us into the mindset of where we move forward on it, I think is a really reasonable expectation from our user base. This will probably come up with things like CSI as well too soon, where there is actually an expected behavior from the cluster, but the implementation is completely arbitrary.
Yeah.
Right.
Something came up in some of these, and is that, and I don't know if this is true, so I need to investigate this more, but from some of the work in trying to do some conformance tests around pre-stop, there were some indication that depending on what CRI you're using, you may get different behavior. So that is an interesting policy point of like, okay, how do we, it's almost like we're already broken as far as conformance is concerned, and how do we handle that situation? Maybe a topic for another call.
All right. Well, thank you all for the lively conversation on that. When I asked about the additional item, I did not expect this. Anything else on conformance? Code organization, which is where I messed up the name before, staring at two bullets.
Hi, can you all hear me?
We sure can.
So the easy one that we were trying to work on was try to find SHAs which are random and see if there are specific versions that we could use. Based on that work, we found a few things that we could fix, but then we are facing some pushback from people saying, okay, we don't want to do this. So that was one thing. So over a period of time, we will get to the point where we'll have a lot of projects with specific SHAs, but there'll still be a bunch of things with random SHAs. especially the XNet stuff for sure. So that was one thing. I don't want to make it mandatory right now or even later, because it's, for example, with C Advisor, right? We tend to cut a random SHA in C Advisor, try it out, and then move to a specific version of C Advisor. So I think we need to keep that going. So it will be like we'll have to, every release at some point we have to check how many random SHAs are there and try to open up issues for different people, different teams, different SIGs to go fix them if possible. I think that's what we have to keep doing. So it will be ongoing work for some time. The main thing why we want to do this is so that when we want to get to the point where, for example, in the Python packaging system, right? So when there is new release coming out, then it's easier for people to look at the change logs and see if there is any security fixes and things like that, and upgrade. So we haven't been able to get to that point. For us, every single time it's inspection, right? And it's very hard to keep up with repositories like Docker, where you have no idea what's going in. So that's the reason why we want to try to minimize the number of repositories with random SHAs. So that was one. The other one that came up was how to remove the OpenStack cloud provider. What do we need to do? What is left? That was a big discussion as well. At this point, what we are saying is that CSI migration is going to go beta in 1.16. So in 1.16 timeframe, we will also publish information from the SIG OpenStack, whatever sub project, about how to use the CSI migration feature with the CSI driver for Cinder to essentially replace the functionality that is in tree. So, and once we get that going in docs and blog posts and whatnot, then in 1.17 we'll take out the in-tree provider for OpenStack. So that will be like really big thing for us, because that's the first one that's going completely external from internal. As part of this process, we also added warning to some additional in-tree volume providers as well. So earlier we used to have only warnings for the cloud providers. Now we have warnings for deprecation warnings for volume plugins as well. So if you know of any volume plugins that people are not are stale essentially, then we can go add an entry in for generating a deprecation warning for that. So that was another one. What else? There are two different vendor dependencies that we are trying to get rid of. One is the iNotify one, and the other one is the GHO DSS YAML. So that is work in progress as well. So that's the main highlights of the things that we were working on. If anybody is interested in this work, please come to our meetings, and there's plenty of things to do. So even today on Twitter, somebody was saying that Go dependency stuff is so hard with Kubernetes, and they don't like the staging stuff. So this is not new news to us. We've all been battling it for a really long time. It's just that sometimes I feel that people complain, but they don't come to help. So if you know somebody who wants to help, please encourage them. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dims. Okay. The last thing we have on here, which was an if you had time, and we have about 8 minutes left, was an issue triage for time allowing. Do we have somebody on who can walk us through the issue triage? I see it was filled out.
I just want to do a PSA before you get into the issue triage. I put it at the end. Was that there's a CAP that's going, I think came from storage folks, which kind of touches that topology awareness in labels issue. I was surprised to see that some high-level API approvers had thought this was okay because I thought it was sacrosanct to not encode that type of information inside of labels. So I just wanted to raise awareness, and maybe we could talk about it next time.
Yeah, thank you. I will, when we're filling out the next time's agenda, I'll add it right at the top. It's the first item, I think.
I can't see the agenda. Did you drop a link to the issue or the PR, Tim?
I'll drop it into chat here.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So with that, is there somebody who wanted to walk us through the triage? Somebody filled it out with a number of issues.
Hey all, I don't think Valerie is here, so but unless someone else wants to speak out to the issues, I can take it since I actually put a couple in there. So for the past couple of weeks, we, Valerie, Deems, some other people whose name I don't remember, we've been triaging the SIG architecture issues. There are a good handful that need some attention. I just chose the top 5 issues that have been updated more recently, just for the sake of time and not to inundate everyone with a ton of work to do. And really just wanted to throw them out there, see if anyone here has any updates. Most of them are relatively old, and there's not a lot of information on next steps or things that need to be done.
I don't have an update, but one of the things that I worry about is like a few months ago, the resiliency thing cropped up, and we were all very excited and trying to do something about it. And then we haven't done anything after that. So how do we keep things going? That's basically the question I have.
So regarding updating top-level approvers, I think we can actually close this now. I think we, like, the suggested action items, I suggested a couple action items that we can reduce the necessity to, like, have many more people here. And I think we actually did all of those, or at least most of those. And I think it works fine. So until we have a better evidence that we really need that, I think we can actually close this.
Okay, I think this is one that some folks will need to follow up on the issue on.
Really quick question for future reference. If we keep doing the issue triage in these sessions, given the time, what type of information will make this process go faster for all of you? What other information will be useful to include in this update?
George, sorry, Jorge, I think we might want to do something a little different. I think we should send out an email with these things the day of the SIG architecture meeting, but before the meeting. So people are able to go click on things.
Okay, sounds good.
Can we try that?
Yeah, yeah, I can absolutely give it a try.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Is there anything else? As I hear silence. 2 minutes back, folks. Thanks everyone for coming. When we filled out this agenda, I didn't expect us to have such rich conversation, all these, and basically fill out the the hour. So we'll see y'all back here in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye bye.